Alan adjusted his glasses for the third time in the last 5 minutes, his fingers gripping the warm cup of nutrient-infused coffee he had barely touched. His heart pounded against his ribs as he stole a quick glance across the vast, multi-leveled atrium of the Intergalactic Academy's main hall. Students of various species moved between towering holographic screens, others debating interstellar trade policies, others debating interstellar trade policies. Among them, effortlessly standing out despite her quiet demeanor, was Zyra. She sat at one of the long tables reserved for research scholars, her slender, sapphire-hued fingers typing rapid sequences into a floating console. Thin strands of bioluminescent markings ran along the sides of her face, pulsating softly with every thought that crossed her mind. Her large, opalescent eyes scanned the data before her with the kind of focused intensity that had earned her the title of the most intelligent student in the academy. Perhaps in the entire quadrant. Alan knew that most students admired her brilliance from a safe distance, whispering about her unmatched intellect, but never daring to disturb her. Alan was different. He wasn't the strongest, nor the most socially adept, but he prided himself on being the kind of person who could engage in meaningful conversation. While others feared Zyra's intellect, he found it fascinating. He had spent countless nights replaying their brief academic exchanges, analyzing the way she effortlessly dismantled complex theories with a few well-placed words. Now, with his fingers tightening around his coffee cup, he was about to do something no one else had ever dared: invite her for a casual chat over coffee. His legs felt like lead as he rose from his seat. He ignored the amused glances of a few fellow human students, some of whom were already whispering among themselves. Alan knew exactly what they were thinking. No human in the academy had ever interacted with Zyra beyond the confines of the lecture halls, much less invited her to something as mundane as a coffee break. As he approached, the glow of Zyra's console reflected off her pale metallic uniform. Her posture remained poised, yet relaxed, as though nothing in the universe could truly disrupt her concentration. For a brief moment, Alan hesitated. The air around her carried a quiet authority, an unspoken presence that made everyone step lightly in her vicinity. He took a slow breath. She's just a student, like me. He cleared his throat. Zyra. The instant he spoke her name, a wave of silence seemed to ripple outward. Conversations dimmed, a few heads turned, their expressions ranging from disbelief to curiosity. Zyra herself paused, her fingers halting in midair before she slowly turned her gaze toward him. Alan swallowed. He hadn't thought this far ahead. Now, standing in the direct line of those luminous, intelligent eyes, he felt a sudden, almost overwhelming urge to turn and walk away. But then Zyra blinked once, tilting her head ever so slightly. A movement so small, yet so profoundly alien, that it reminded him just how different she was from everyone else at this academy. "Yes?" she asked, her voice smooth and measured, lacking the impatience he had feared. Encouraged, he straightened his shoulders. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab a coffee with me." A single second passed. Then another. Around them, the few students still pretending not to eavesdrop froze in anticipation. Alan could practically hear their thoughts. Did he really just ask Zyra to coffee? Zyra studied him with quiet intensity, her gaze sweeping over him as if assessing variables he couldn't begin to comprehend. Then, to everyone's shock, her lips parted slightly in what could only be described as mild amusement. "Coffee," she repeated, as if testing the word on her tongue. Alan nodded quickly, eager to push forward before his confidence crumbled. "Yeah, a break. A chance to talk outside of equations and research papers." Zyra remained motionless for a fraction longer than what felt natural. Then, slowly, she closed her console, the holographic projections flickering into nothingness. "Very well." A hushed murmur spread through the hall. Alan barely registered it as Zyra rose from her seat, standing a head taller than him despite her delicate frame. The glow of her markings pulsed subtly, her movements fluid and controlled. Without another word, she gestured for him to lead the way. Alan turned, fighting the instinct to glance back at the shocked expressions of their peers. He had done it. He had actually done it. Whether this would end in disaster or be the beginning of something incredible, he had no idea. But as he led Zyra toward the cafe, one thought burned brightly in his mind. This might be the most insane thing I've ever done. Little did he know, it was about to get much, much crazier. Alan walked beside Zyra, his heart still hammering against his ribs. The Academy's cafe wasn't far, just across the central plaza. But every step felt agonizingly slow under the weight of 100 curious stares. Conversations quieted as students stole glances, whispering behind holotablets and telepathic links. Alan pretended not to notice, though his ears burned with the unspoken question hanging in the air. Why is she going with him? Zyra, on the other hand, moved with the same graceful indifference she always carried. She walked as though the scrutiny didn't exist, her expression calm, her luminous markings pulsing faintly in a rhythmic pattern Alan couldn't decipher. If she was aware of the silent uproar around them, she gave no indication. As they reached the cafe's entrance, the automated doors slid open with a soft hiss. The scent of roasted cathal beans and freshly synthesized pastries filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of student chatter. Alan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped forward, glancing at Zyra. She stood at the threshold, her gaze sweeping across the cafe. The flickering holomanus above the counter displayed a variety of beverages, some human, others designed for alien physiology. She tilted her head slightly, as if assessing the space, before stepping inside with measured precision. Alan led the way to an unoccupied table near the large transparent wall overlooking the Academy's floating gardens. The view was breathtaking. Clusters of vibrant flora from different worlds drifted in suspended orbits, their bioluminescent petals glowing in the artificial twilight. He pulled out a chair, but Zyra had already seated herself before he could offer. A service drone hovered nearby, awaiting their order. Alan glanced at her. "Do you drink coffee?" She regarded him with an unreadable expression. "I have consumed caffeine-based stimulants before." He bit the inside of his cheek, unsure if that meant she actually liked them. "Well, this place has different options. There's Terran-style coffee, but there's also a few blends from other systems." She shifted her gaze to the floating menu, scanning the options at an alarming speed. The drone whirred expectantly. Then, after a short pause, she made her selection. A standard Earth coffee, no additives. Alan ordered the same. The drone beeped and zipped away, leaving them in silence. He fidgeted with the corner of his sleeve, acutely aware of how surreal this moment was. Just hours ago, the idea of sitting across from Zyra in a casual setting had been unthinkable. She folded her hands neatly on the table, her fingers resting against each other in perfect symmetry. "You are nervous." Alan nearly choked on his own breath. "What? No. I mean, maybe a little." Her glowing eyes studied him, not with mockery, but with genuine curiosity. "Why?" He hesitated, debating whether to lie, but there was no point. "Because I wasn't sure you'd say yes." A flicker of something passed across her expression, something almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. "And yet, you asked?" He exhaled a quiet laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah. Guess I figured I had nothing to lose." Their drinks arrived, the steaming cups placed neatly before them. Zyra lifted hers with both hands, inhaling the aroma with a thoughtful expression. She took a tentative sip, then set it down with precise control. Alan watched her, amused. "Well?" She met his gaze. "Bitter," he grinned. "Yeah, that's coffee." She remained silent for a moment, then took another sip, as if recalibrating her opinion. The glow along her markings pulsed once, subtly shifting in hue. Alan wasn't sure what that meant, but he decided to take it as a positive sign. The cafe around them had settled somewhat, though the occasional glance still flickered in their direction. Alan forced himself to ignore it, focusing instead on the girl in front of him. "So," he began, resting his elbow on the table, "why did you agree to this?" Zyra didn't answer immediately. She placed her cup down, the movement precise, deliberate. "Because you asked." He blinked. "That's it?" She tilted her head slightly, as if considering her words. "Most individuals hesitate when interacting with me outside academic settings. You did not." Alan raised an eyebrow. "I was terrified, actually." A flicker of amusement crossed her face. "Yet you proceeded." He shrugged. "Yeah, well, I guess I just really wanted to talk to you." Zyra regarded him with quiet intensity. The question caught him off guard. He had expected to be the one asking questions, not the other way around. He tapped his fingers against his coffee cup, thinking, "Because you're brilliant and not in the gets good grades kind of way. You see things differently. I wanted to know what that's like." For the first time since they sat down, Zyra seemed genuinely taken aback. She didn't speak for several seconds. The glow of her markings pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. Finally, she leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance between them. "You are different from the others." Alan's mouth went dry. "Is that a good thing?" She didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, she lifted her cup again and took another sip of coffee. "Yes." Alan barely had time to process Zyra's words before a sudden, sharp change in the atmosphere sent a chill down his spine. The air in the cafe, once filled with quiet conversations and the hum of service drones, had turned unnaturally still. A ripple of unease spread through the students around them. Eyes widened, heads turned toward the entrance. Some rose from their seats, stepping back instinctively. A moment later, the doors to the cafe slid open, and a squad of armored figures marched inside. Alan's fingers tightened around his coffee cup as his mind struggled to keep up with what he was seeing. The newcomers were unlike any of the Academy's security personnel. Their armor gleamed under the artificial lighting, a deep metallic black adorned with intricate golden insignias. Their helmets, shaped to resemble the fierce avian creatures of the Valonian homeworld, obscured their faces, but their rigid posture and synchronized movements made it clear they were not here by coincidence. A hush fell over the cafe. Students exchanged nervous glances, some slowly backing away from the entrance. Alan, despite his growing sense of dread, forced himself to remain seated. He glanced at Zyra, searching for any sign of concern, but she remained still, her expression unreadable. One of the armored figures stepped forward, and with a sharp motion, he pressed a control panel on his wrist. The helmet retracted with a soft hiss, revealing a stern, chiseled face with deep-set eyes that burned with authority. His dark hair was slicked back, and the markings on his temple shimmered faintly under the cafe's lighting. His gaze locked onto Zyra immediately. "Princess," he said, his voice firm, carrying the weight of command. "You are to return to the royal chambers at once." Alan's breath caught in his throat. The word echoed in his mind. "Princess." Zyra remained motionless, her fingers lightly resting against her coffee cup. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried a subtle edge. "I am not finished." The officer's expression hardened. "You know this is not up for discussion." Alan barely registered the growing murmur of students behind him. His mind reeled, trying to piece together what was happening. Princess? He had thought Zyra was just another student, albeit an exceptional one, but this? This was something else entirely. The officer took a step closer, the golden insignia on his chest catching the light. "Your father commands your presence immediately. There are political matters that require your attention. You cannot waste time engaging in trivial interactions." Alan's stomach twisted. He felt the weight of those words settle over him, cold and heavy. The officer hadn't even looked at him, hadn't acknowledged his existence beyond being an unfortunate obstacle in the way of whatever duty Zyra was meant to fulfill. Zyra's markings pulsed slightly, and for the first time Alan noticed a subtle shift in her posture, not fear, not resignation, something else, defiance. "I will leave when I choose," she said, her voice unwavering. Not before. The officer's jaw tightened. The tension in the air thickened. A few students whispered frantically among themselves, the realization of Zyra's true identity rippling through the crowd. Alan's pulse pounded in his ears. He had no idea what to do. This was far beyond anything he had ever expected. What could he possibly say? What could he even offer in this moment? The officer exhaled sharply through his nose. You are under royal protection. That means your choices are not your own. You do not have the luxury of indulging in, his eyes flicked to Alan for the briefest of seconds, frivolous companionship. Alan felt a sharp sting at the words, but before he could react, Zyra spoke again. My decisions are my own. Her voice was steel, her gaze steady. I will return when I see fit. For a moment there was silence. The officer's expression darkened. He seemed ready to argue further, but something in Zyra's demeanor gave him pause. Then, with a slow inhale, he straightened. His eyes flicked to Alan again, this time with cold scrutiny as if assessing a problem rather than a person. This matter is far from over, he said, but for now I will comply. He took a step back, pressing a button on his wrist. The other armored figures shifted in perfect synchronization, retreating toward the entrance. As they exited, the cafe seemed to exhale all at once. The tension that had gripped the room began to fade, replaced by hushed but frantic conversations. Alan remained frozen, staring at the doors long after they had closed. He forced himself to breathe. Then, slowly, he turned to Zyra. She met his gaze evenly. You're a princess, he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Yes. You didn't think that was worth mentioning? She tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. Would it have changed anything? Alan opened his mouth, then closed it. Would it have? If he had known, would he have had the courage to invite her for coffee? Or would he have done what everyone else did, admired her from a distance, too afraid to approach? His silence must have answered for him, because Zyra's markings pulsed again, softer this time. She lifted her cup and took another sip of coffee, completely unfazed. Alan let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. This is insane? Zyra lowered her cup. A faint trace of amusement flickered across her face. Perhaps. Alan sat in stunned silence, his fingers still curled around his coffee cup, though he had long since forgotten about the drink. His mind raced, trying to catch up with the reality unfolding in front of him. Zyra, the brilliant, mysterious girl he had admired from afar, was not just a student. She was royalty. And not just any royalty, but a princess of the Valonian Empire, one of the most powerful factions in the galaxy. The realization settled in his chest like a stone. It wasn't just that she was important. It was the implications of what that meant. The way the officer had spoken to her, the way the guards had appeared out of nowhere. It was clear that Zyra's life was not her own. She wasn't just a student at the academy, free to make choices like everyone else. She was under watch, under orders, bound by responsibilities that none of the other students, certainly not Alan, could begin to comprehend. Zyra, however, appeared completely unaffected. She took another sip of her coffee, her posture still composed, her markings pulsing faintly. It was as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just defied an imperial command in front of an entire room of students. Alan finally found his voice. "Are you in trouble?" Zyra set her cup down, tilting her head slightly. "Not yet. Not yet?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You just ignored a direct order from your own people." She regarded him with a level gaze. "I did. And that doesn't worry you?" Her markings pulsed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "No." Alan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Okay, well, it worries me." He glanced toward the entrance as if expecting the guards to storm back in at any moment. "Are they just going to let this go? That guy didn't exactly seem thrilled about you staying here." Zyra studied him for a moment, as if assessing how much she wanted to explain. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "My father does not control me as completely as he wishes. His authority reaches far, but I am beyond his immediate grasp while I am here. He can send his envoys, his warnings, his commands, but until I step onto a Valonian ship, I am not bound by his will." Alan frowned. "So this academy protects you?" "Not directly, but it operates under intergalactic law. As long as I remain a student here, I am outside the Empire's jurisdiction." Alan narrowed his eyes. "That sounds like a loophole." A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "It is." He let out a breath, shaking his head. "So, you came here to escape?" Her expression remained unreadable, but her markings pulsed faintly, as if in thought. "To observe." Alan arched an eyebrow. "Observe what?" She glanced out the window, where the Academy's floating gardens shimmered in the artificial twilight. "Everything." He followed her gaze, watching the way the light refracted through the translucent petals of alien flowers, the way students of all species moved between study halls, oblivious to the weight of the conversation happening at this very table. After a moment, Zyra spoke again, her voice softer. "I have spent my life surrounded by advisors, commanders, scholars, all sworn to serve the Empire. Their knowledge, their perspectives, are shaped by loyalty, by duty, by the weight of centuries of rule. But here, among the students, there is no allegiance, no expectation of obedience. There is only learning, possibility, a view of the galaxy untainted by Valonian doctrine." Alan listened in silence. He had never thought about the Academy that way before. To him, it had always been just a school, a place to study, to prepare for a future career. But for Zyra, it was something far more profound. It was a window into a universe she had never been allowed to see. He looked back at her. "And now they're trying to pull you back." Her gaze returned to him, steady and unwavering. "They have always been trying." Alan let that sink in. He thought back to the officer's words, the way he had dismissed Zyra's choices as unimportant, as if her will meant nothing. He thought about how she had defied him without hesitation, how she had chosen to stay here, to sit across from Alan and drink coffee instead of returning to the life that had already been planned for her. And then, before he could stop himself, he asked, "Why did you stay?" The question hung in the air between them. Zyra studied him for a long moment, and for the first time, he saw something in her expression that he couldn't quite name. It wasn't amusement or calculation or even curiosity. It was something else. Finally, she spoke. "Because I was not finished." Alan blinked. With what? Her markings pulsed once, a slow, rhythmic glow. "This." She lifted her coffee cup again, taking a sip as if the conversation had never happened, as if the weight of empires, of expectations, of royal commands was nothing more than a background hum in the grand scheme of things. Alan, for the life of him, didn't know whether to laugh or be terrified. But as he sat back, his own coffee growing cold in his hands, he realized one thing with absolute certainty. He had just stepped into something far bigger than himself. Alan's fingers tapped absently against the side of his cup, the rhythmic motion barely audible against the hum of conversation that had started to return to the cafe. His mind, however, was anything but calm. Everything he had believed about his quiet, academic life at the Intergalactic Academy had been dismantled within the span of an afternoon. Zyra, a girl he had thought of as simply the smartest student in school, was a princess. Not just a noble, not just an influential figure, an heir to an empire. One with a reach far beyond what he could comprehend, and yet she had chosen to sit across from him, drinking coffee, as though none of that mattered. He knew better. It did matter. His stomach twisted as he recalled the officer's words, the way the entire cafe had frozen at the sight of the royal guards. He could still feel the weight of their gazes, the silent judgment in the way they had looked at him, like he was nothing, like he was just another insignificant student who had somehow blundered into a world where he didn't belong. Alan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to push the doubt aside. He had asked Zyra why she had stayed, and she had answered in the simplest way possible. because she had wanted to, because she had chosen to. But for how long? He shifted his gaze to her, watching as she lifted her cup with that same measured precision she always had. The glow of her markings remained steady, her expression composed, but there was something in the way she sat now, something almost waiting. Alan licked his lips, hesitating before he spoke. What happens now? Zyra set her cup down, her opalescent eyes locking onto his. Now? She repeated, as if testing the word. He nodded. I mean, what do you do from here? You said your father doesn't control you as much as he wants to, but for how long? You defied a direct order from the Empire today. That has to mean something. She regarded him with quiet contemplation before she answered. It means I have drawn another line. Alan frowned. Another? She inclined her head slightly. Defiance is not a single act, Alan. It is a process, one that does not end simply because a command is ignored. He let her words settle, trying to piece together what she meant. So, this isn't the first time. No. His fingers tightened slightly around his cup. And every time you do this, draw a line, how much closer do you get to them forcing you to go back? She was silent for a long moment, her gaze unfocused, as though she were looking at something far beyond the walls of the cafe. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than before. Closer. Alan swallowed. There it was, the inevitable truth she hadn't said outright. No matter how many lines she drew, no matter how many small acts of defiance she committed, the Empire would not let her go. Sooner or later, the weight of her royal blood would crush whatever freedom she had carved out for herself. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. So that's it? He asked, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. You just wait for them to drag you back? Zyra's gaze sharpened slightly, and for the first time there was something almost like irritation in her expression. If that were my intent, I would not be here. Alan opened his mouth, ready to argue, but then he stopped. She was right. She had chosen to be here. Every moment she stayed, every command she defied was proof of that. She wasn't simply waiting for the inevitable. She was resisting it in every way she could. But for how long? He exhaled slowly. Is there anything you can do to stop it? Her markings pulsed faintly, her fingers resting lightly against the table. Not yet. Alan hated that answer. He hated the uncertainty in it, the sense of inevitability that still lingered beneath her calm exterior. But most of all, he hated the fact that he couldn't do anything to change it. And then, before he could think better of it, he said, "What if you didn't go back?" Zyra blinked, her head tilting slightly. "Explain." He hesitated, but only for a second. "You said the academy keeps you out of your father's reach, right? What if you went further? What if you left completely? Not just the school, but the Empire?" A flicker of something passed across her face, too brief to name, but unmistakably there. She studied him, and for the first time he felt like he was the subject of an analysis, not the other way around. "That," she said slowly, "would require careful consideration." Alan leaned forward. "But it's possible?" A long pause. Then finally she nodded. "It is." His heart pounded. He hadn't meant to say any of this. He hadn't planned it. But now that the words were out, he couldn't take them back. She could leave. Not just temporarily, not just until the next time her father sent his guards to bring her home. She could leave, really leave, and be free of all of it. But he wasn't naive. He knew what that would mean. She would be in exile. She would be hunted. The Empire would never stop searching for her. And yet, as he looked at her, he saw something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Not just defiance, not just determination. Hope. She lifted her coffee cup one last time, taking a slow sip before setting it down with finality. Then she met his gaze. "If I were to leave," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering, "where would I go?" Alan felt his chest tighten, but he didn't look away. He had no power, no influence, no grand plan to offer her. He was just a student, just a human, sitting across from a girl who held the weight of an empire on her shoulders. But what he did have was an answer. Anywhere you want. For the first time since he had met her, Zyra smiled. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. And in that moment, Alan realized something. She had already made her decision. It wouldn't be today or tomorrow or even next week. But one day Zyra would leave, and when she did, she wouldn't just be escaping an empire. She would be choosing her own future. And Alan, he would make sure she got there.